Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was surrounded by Dallas police officers who were convinced that the 43-year-old Texas representative was inciting gang violence and creating a dangerous situation in the middle of a South Dallas neighborhood. The officers had arrived to find the outspoken Democratic Congresswoman standing between two groups of angry young men, shouting what appeared to be inflammatory rhetoric while tensions escalated around her. But what the responding officers didn't understand was that Jasmine Crockett wasn't stirring up trouble. She was using every ounce of her political skill and community credibility to prevent a gang war that would have left multiple people dead and terrorized an entire neighborhood for months to come. The crisis had begun 3 days earlier when 17-year-old Marcus Johnson, a member of the Oak Cliff Bloods, was shot and seriously wounded in what appeared to be a drive-by shooting by members of the rival East Side Crips. The shooting had taken place outside Lincoln High School during dismissal time, traumatizing hundreds of students and reigniting a gang feud that had been relatively quiet for over 2 years. Both gangs were now preparing for retaliation that threatened to turn South Dallas into a war zone. Jasmine Crockett had been following the situation closely through her community outreach coordinators who maintained relationships with youth organizations, schools, and community leaders throughout her district. As someone who had grown up in similar neighborhoods and understood the devastating impact of gang violence on families and communities, she knew that without immediate intervention, the cycle of retaliation would spiral out of control, potentially claiming dozens of lives over the coming weeks. What made this situation particularly dangerous was that both gangs had recently recruited new members, teenagers who were eager to prove themselves, and older members who had been released from prison with grudges to settle. Intelligence from community sources suggested that both sides were planning major retaliatory attacks that would go far beyond the typical drive-by shootings, potentially involving multiple casualties and innocent bystanders. Rather than simply calling for increased police presence or holding press conferences about gang violence, Congresswoman Crockett decided to take direct action by using her political position and community relationships to mediate between the warring factions. It was an incredibly risky strategy that put her personal safety at stake, but she believed it was the only way to prevent the bloodshed that seemed inevitable if the situation continued to escalate. Working through trusted community intermediaries, Crockett arranged to meet with representatives from both gangs at a neutral location, the parking lot of Mount Olive Baptist Church on Malcolm X Boulevard, where she had attended services as a child. The meeting was supposed to be secret, with only the gang leaders and a few trusted community elders present, but word had leaked out and tensions were running high as both sides arrived with more members than originally planned. When Crockett arrived at the church parking lot at 3:30 p.m. on a hot Tuesday afternoon, she found nearly 40 young men divided into two hostile groups, separated by about 50 yards of asphalt and several generations of mutual hatred. The Bloods occupied the east side of the parking lot, wearing their signature red bandanas and clustering around several expensive cars with custom modifications. The Crips controlled the west side, displaying their blue colors and maintaining the aggressive postures that had become their trademark. Between the two groups stood Jasmine Crockett, wearing a simple black pantsuit and carrying herself with the dignity that had made her one of the most respected voices in Congress. But to outside observers, particularly law enforcement officers who might respond to reports of gang activity, her presence in the middle of a tense confrontation would appear to be evidence of political grandstanding or worse, an attempt to incite violence for media attention. Listen to me, all of you. Crockett began, her voice carrying the authority that had made her famous in congressional hearings and committee meetings. I know you're angry. I know you want justice for Marcus. I know you think violence is the only language that gets respect on these streets. But I'm here to tell you that there's another way, and I'm going to help you find it. Her words were passionate and direct, exactly the kind of rhetoric that could be misinterpreted by observers who didn't understand the context. The gang members listened with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity as Crockett outlined her understanding of their grievances and her proposal for resolving the conflict without further bloodshed. She had done her homework, learning the names of victims from previous conflicts, understanding the economic and social factors that drove young men to gang membership, and researching successful intervention programs from other cities. But as Crockett continued her mediation efforts, her voice rising with passion as she challenged both sides to consider the impact of their actions on their families and communities, several residents in the surrounding neighborhood began calling 911 to report what appeared to be a dangerous confrontation involving dozens of gang members and a woman who was stirring them up and making the situation worse. There's some kind of gang meeting happening at Mount Olive Baptist Church, one caller told the 911 dispatcher. There's about 40 young men out there, and there's a woman in the middle of them who's shouting and getting everyone worked up. It looks like a riot is about to break out. The caller's description, while technically accurate, completely mischaracterized Crockett's role in the situation and the nature of her intervention. Dallas police officers Robert Hayes and Maria Santos were dispatched to respond to multiple reports of gang activity and potential violence at the church. Both officers were experienced in dealing with gang-related incidents, but they had no advance knowledge of Crockett's mediation efforts or her attempt to prevent rather than incite violence. They arrived expecting to find a dangerous confrontation that required immediate law enforcement intervention. When officers Hayes and Santos pulled into the church parking lot, they saw exactly what the 911 callers had described: dozens of young men displaying gang colors and affiliations, separated into hostile groups, with a woman in the middle who appeared to be addressing both sides with animated gestures and raised voice. From their perspective, the scene looked like a dangerous situation that was on the verge of exploding into violence. "Ma'am, step away from those individuals immediately," Officer Hayes commanded through his patrol car's loudspeaker as he and Santos positioned their vehicle between the two groups of gang members. "This is the Dallas Police Department, and we're ordering everyone to disperse immediately." The arrival of police officers immediately changed the dynamic of the situation, threatening to destroy the delicate progress that Crockett had been making in her mediation efforts. But instead of stepping away as ordered, Crockett continued her conversation with the gang leaders, knowing that the arrival of police might be the catalyst that pushed the situation toward violence rather than resolution. "Officers, I'm Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, and I'm conducting a community mediation session," she called out while maintaining her position between the two groups. "Please give me a few more minutes to complete this process." Officer Santos, who didn't immediately recognize Crockett and was focused on what appeared to be a dangerous gang confrontation, interpreted her refusal to step away as evidence that she was indeed inciting or coordinating gang activity. "Ma'am, I don't care who you claim to be. You're interfering with a police investigation and potentially inciting violence. You need to move away from those individuals right now." The misunderstanding escalated quickly as both gang factions began responding to the police presence with the hostility that characterized their typical interactions with law enforcement. Members of both groups started moving toward their vehicles, reaching for items that could be weapons, and positioning themselves defensively in ways that made the officers increasingly concerned about the potential for violence. "See what you've done," Crockett said to the officers, her frustration evident as she watched 3 days of careful community work beginning to unravel. "These young men were making progress toward peace, and your arrival has destroyed the trust we've been building. Now everyone's defensive and scared, and the situation is actually more dangerous than when you arrived." Her criticism of the police response only reinforced their belief that she was anti-law enforcement and potentially encouraging violence. Officer Hayes stepped out of his patrol car and approached Crockett directly. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for inciting violence, interfering with police operations, and creating a public disturbance. You have the right to remain silent." His decision to arrest her was based on his genuine belief that she was making a dangerous situation worse rather than better, and that removing her from the scene would help de-escalate tensions. As handcuffs were placed on Congresswoman Crockett's wrists in full view of both gang factions, the situation that she had been carefully managing began spiraling toward exactly the kind of violence she had been trying to prevent. Gang members on both sides interpreted her arrest as evidence that the police were taking sides in their conflict, and several young men began making the aggressive moves that typically preceded gang violence. "You can't arrest her," shouted Deshaun Williams, a 19-year-old Blood who had been responding positively to Crockett's mediation efforts. "She was helping us work this out. She was trying to stop the violence." His protest was echoed by members of both gangs, who suddenly found themselves united in their anger at what they perceived as police interference in a community solution to their problems. But the officers, faced with an increasingly hostile crowd of gang members and convinced that Crockett had been manipulating the situation for her own purposes, called for backup and began preparing to arrest multiple individuals for gang activity and public disturbance. What had been a promising mediation session was rapidly turning into exactly the kind of confrontation that would reinforce cycles of violence and mistrust. It was at this critical moment that Reverend Marcus Thompson, the 67-year-old pastor of Mount Olive Baptist Church, emerged from the building where he had been monitoring the situation and preparing to offer his support for Crockett's mediation efforts. As someone who had been working with gang members and their families for over 30 years, he immediately understood both the progress that had been made and the danger that the police intervention represented. "Officers, please wait," Reverend Thompson called out as he approached the patrol cars. "That woman you just arrested is Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, and she's been working for 3 days to prevent a gang war that could have killed dozens of people in this neighborhood. She's not inciting violence, she's preventing it." His intervention provided the credible community voice that could potentially reverse the officer's misunderstanding of the situation. Officer Santos paused in her preparations to transport Crockett to jail, beginning to realize that they might have misinterpreted the situation entirely. "Reverend, are you saying that this woman is actually a member of Congress?" she asked, "and that she was trying to stop gang violence rather than encourage it?" The possibility that they had arrested a federal lawmaker for preventing rather than causing violence was beginning to dawn on both officers. Reverend Thompson pulled out his phone and showed the officers recent news articles about Crockett's community work, her congressional service, and her efforts to address gang violence through mediation rather than incarceration. Officers, Congresswoman Crockett has been working with community leaders and gang intervention specialists to prevent retaliation for the shooting at Lincoln High School. She wasn't stirring up trouble, she was risking her own safety to stop a war. As the officers began to understand the magnitude of their mistake, the gang members who had been preparing for confrontation started explaining what had actually been happening during the mediation session. "She was getting us to talk instead of shoot," explained Carlos Martinez, a Crips leader who had been skeptical of Crockett's intervention but had begun to respect her approach. "For the first time in years, we were actually listening to each other instead of planning attacks." Officer Hayes immediately removed Crockett's handcuffs and offered a formal apology for the misunderstanding. "Congresswoman Crockett, I sincerely apologize for our error. We responded to reports of gang violence and didn't realize that you were conducting a legitimate community intervention. We should have assessed the situation more thoroughly before taking action." His apology was genuine, but the damage to the mediation process had already been done. But rather than focusing on the officer's mistake, Crockett immediately turned her attention back to the gang members, who were now watching to see how she would respond to being arrested and then released. Her reaction would determine whether the trust she had been building could be restored, or whether the police intervention had permanently damaged her credibility as a mediator. "Brothers, what just happened here proves exactly what we've been talking about," Crockett said, addressing both gangs directly. "The system assumes the worst about all of us. The police saw you and assumed violence. They saw me and assumed I was causing trouble instead of preventing it. But we can't let their assumptions control our actions. We still have the power to choose peace over violence, understanding over revenge." Her response to the arrest, focusing on systemic issues rather than personal grievances, resonated powerfully with gang members who had experienced similar assumptions and misunderstandings throughout their lives. Instead of destroying her credibility, the incident actually strengthened her connection with young men who now saw her as someone who truly understood their experiences with law enforcement and community prejudice. Over the next 2 hours, with the police officers now serving as witnesses rather than obstacles, Crockett successfully mediated an agreement between the two gangs that included a formal ceasefire, a joint community service project, and a commitment to resolve future disputes through mediation rather than violence. The agreement was unprecedented in the neighborhood's recent history and offered genuine hope for breaking cycles of retaliation. The success of the mediation became national news, with major media outlets covering the story of how a congresswoman had prevented gang violence through direct community engagement rather than traditional law enforcement approaches. But the coverage also highlighted the initial police response and the assumptions that had nearly derailed a successful peace process. Officer Hayes and Santos both participated in follow-up training sessions about gang intervention and community mediation, learning to recognize the difference between activities that incite violence and those that prevent it. Their experience became a case study for police departments across the country about the importance of understanding community dynamics before intervening in complex social situations. 3 weeks after the mediation session, there had been no retaliatory violence between the two gangs, marking the longest period of peace in the neighborhood in over 5 years. Community leaders credited Crockett's intervention with preventing what could have been a devastating escalation of violence that would have affected hundreds of families and businesses in South Dallas. Marcus Johnson, the teenager whose shooting had triggered the potential gang war, recovered from his injuries, and became an advocate for the peace agreement that Crockett had helped negotiate. "Congresswoman Crockett risked her safety to protect my neighborhood," he said in a community meeting. "She didn't just talk about stopping violence. She put herself in the middle of a dangerous situation to make it happen." The incident led to formal cooperation between Crockett's office and the Dallas Police Department on gang intervention and community mediation programs. The partnership created new protocols for responding to gang-related incidents that emphasized de-escalation and community involvement rather than purely enforcement-based approaches. 6 months later, Crockett was invited to speak at a national conference on community policing and gang intervention, where she shared the lessons learned from her mediation experience and the importance of understanding community dynamics before making assumptions about criminal activity. Her presentation was attended by police chiefs, community leaders, and federal officials who wanted to replicate her success in their own jurisdictions. The young men who had participated in the mediation continued to honor their peace agreement, with several members of both gangs eventually enrolling in job training programs and community college courses supported by resources that Crockett had helped secure through her congressional office. The transformation of their neighborhood became a model for gang intervention programs across Texas. Reverend Thompson used the success of the mediation to launch a broader community peace initiative, bringing together former gang members, community leaders, and law enforcement officials to address the root causes of violence in South Dallas. The program, supported by federal grants that Crockett helped secure, became one of the most successful gang intervention efforts in the country. Officer Hayes, reflecting on the experience months later, acknowledged that it had fundamentally changed his approach to community policing. "I learned that sometimes what looks like trouble is actually the solution," he said. "Congresswoman Crockett taught me to look deeper into situations before making assumptions about what's happening and why." The story of Jasmine Crockett's arrest and subsequent vindication became a powerful example of how community leaders can make a difference through direct engagement rather than political rhetoric. Her willingness to put herself at risk to prevent violence demonstrated a level of public service that transcended traditional political boundaries and party affiliations. 1 year after the incident, the neighborhood that had been on the brink of gang warfare hosted its first annual Peace Day celebration, bringing together hundreds of residents, community leaders, and law enforcement officials to celebrate the transformation that had begun with one congresswoman's willingness to stand between hostile groups and demand a better solution than violence. For Jasmine Crockett, the experience reinforced her belief that effective political leadership requires more than speeches and legislation. It demands personal engagement with the communities and challenges that government is supposed to serve. Real change happens when we get out from behind our desks and into the streets where people are actually living and struggling, she often told other politicians. Today, the mediation techniques that Crockett used to prevent gang violence in South Dallas are being studied and replicated by community leaders across the country. Her example has inspired other elected officials to take more direct roles in conflict resolution and community healing, moving beyond traditional political approaches to address the root causes of violence and social division. The case of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett being arrested for inciting trouble while actually preventing gang violence serves as a powerful reminder that sometimes the most important public service happens not in congressional hearings or committee meetings, but in parking lots and community centers where real people face real dangers. Her story demonstrates that true leadership sometimes means risking misunderstanding, arrest, and personal safety to do what's right for the communities we serve.